Metaphor ReFantazio arrives as one of the most ambitious RPGs Atlus has attempted, blending the studio's pedigree for character-driven storytelling with a bold new fantasy setting. And rather than simply following in the footsteps of Persona, it seeks to carve out its own identity, one that challenges players to consider not just how they fight, but how they define themselves in a world of shifting allegiances and layered symbolism. With a very striking art direction, intricate systems, and a narrative that promises both spectacle and introspection, the game positions itself as a landmark release in the genre. Having spent the past couple months completing this game, whether it succeeds on living up to that ambition is a question worth exploring, and one that reveals much about the current state of Japanese RPGs. Welcome back to the channel, friends. Really excited to be talking about Metaphor ReFantazio today, starting with some thoughts I had on the overall gameplay experience. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Would love to have you along for the journey as I just play random games every week and talk about them. Atlus in recent generations has cultivated a very recognizable rhythm in its modern JRPGs, particularly through the Persona series, as well as Shin Megami Tensei, and now Metaphor ReFantazio both inherits and reimagines some of that. The general loop overall revolves around three core pillars of gameplay. The first major one and most interesting, I think, is the calendar and time management system. This is one of Atlus's signature mechanics, is the calendar system overall, and where each day is divided into segments and how you decide to spend that limited time. Are you going to train? Are you going to build relationships? Push the story forward by completing dungeons? That kind of constant trade-off creates tension and strategy because you can't be doing everything all the time. And the calendar also anchors the pace of the overall narrative with major events unfolding on fixed dates. So you feel like you're living through a timeline rather than just grinding endlessly through dungeon after dungeon or story beat after story beat. Combat systems is that second pillar and is unique in some ways to Atlus games. So in these JRPGs, they are of course turn-based at their core, but they're usually designed to reward smart play over brute force. So a good example is success usually comes from exploiting enemy weaknesses or managing resources carefully, and building a party that complements each other's strengths. There are unique mechanics like preemptive strikes and ambushes that can occur on the overworld and create a sense of risk and reward to the gameplay, while there are also deep RPG systems that encourage you to fuse personas or, reimagine your archetypes as you see fit to create the best party composition. And then the third great aspect is the storytelling, which is the backbone of Atlus games. The narrative really isn't just a backdrop for battles, it's usually the main driver of the experience. The characters that accompany you along the journey grow through personal arcs, their relationships with you deepen through dialogue choices and conversations that you have, and themes often explore around identity, society, and psychology. Another thing I've always really liked about Atlus RPGs in particular is how they blend everyday realism with the more mythic aspects of the games. So like you're going to school, or you're building friendships, or you're dealing with other personal life challenges. And then at the end of it, there's also these supernatural stakes underlying it, kind of creating this dual layered narrative that feels both intimate and epic at the same time. And that balance is what makes their JRPGs resonate so strongly with most players. Now the core loop in Metaphor ReFantazio specifically is quite familiar to those other titles. You're going to explore dungeons, you're going to fight enemies, manage archetypes, which are essentially this game's form of persona, and they function just a little differently, while also managing equipment and then returning to your supporters for narrative progression and continuing forward in the story. But one thing I did personally experience is that the pacing in Metaphor ReFantazio is a little uneven compared to a lot of other Atlus titles, and it's really marred by my need to try to pack everything into one playthrough. If you're like me and something I don't think Atlus really anticipated for people playing this game, you went ahead and completed every dungeon within a single day, when the dungeon was available of course, and maximized your time to the utmost. Now resultingly, that did honestly cause me to spend hours and hours slogging through combat heavy dungeons, only then to spend hours and hours catching up on supporter conversations and watching story beats unfold. And that back-to-back structure where there's a little variation in the style of gameplay. Say I only have an hour or two to play video games every evening, and that hour or two is spent either doing this kind of copy-paste dungeon or watching a 2-hour cutscene. I mean, that little variation in the gameplay rhythm felt really draining after a while. So as I mentioned, that's kind of a personal thing. Your mileage is going to vary on how you experience that based on your approach. And Persona is not much different. It meets this title with a similar rhythm in the terms of you're going to go into the dungeons and then you're going to spend time catching up with people and experiencing the story. But for me personally, Metaphor ReFantazio felt like both halves of this equation were a little longer than in those other games, meaning that the pace weared on me a little bit more than some of the other titles. And more mechanically, in this game, the combat is both refreshing and a little frustrating at times. To discuss the changes that I found to be very positive, there is an overworld real-time combat mechanic which is pretty straightforward, and you can attack enemies if they are lower leveled and will basically explode right there. And if those enemies match or exceed your level, you get the opportunity to set up an advantage in the turn-based combat by significantly damaging them prior to the fight. Now, one thing is that the enemies could attack back and do the same to you and set up an ambush that affects you in the fight, but you do have the ability to dodge and beat out their attempts, and so this little overworld aspect was pretty cool to me. Because many of the enemies in this game are damage sponges, and you can double the time to complete what could already end up being like a 5-minute fight, and double that, which began to drive me a little crazy whenever it happened. But overall, I did like that aspect, and there are also a number of strategic elements that have been developed from other Atlus games that I appreciated as well. One of those aspects is the press turn system, which comes from the Shin Megami Tensei series. It rewards you with extra actions whenever you hit an enemy's weakness or land a critical strike, which lets your party chain more attacks and really overwhelm foes. But if enemies exploit your weaknesses, they get those same exact opportunities. So balancing the risk and reward is a lot of fun. Another thing I somewhat mentioned is the archetypes in Metaphor ReFantazio. These work kind of like a flexible job system as opposed to this catch-em-all Pokemon style of play that's present in Persona, for example. And this allows characters to transform into different roles, such as a warrior or a mage, to unlock new abilities and strategies that you can employ across your fights. Now, I haven't played a ton of job system-based RPGs, but I did like the overall concept, and it reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy XII, which I enjoyed that game a ton, and one of the big aspects of liking it for me was how cool and robust Final Fantasy XII's job system was for your party. Resultingly for this job system, archetypes emphasize external roles and skill mastery within the fantasy world, and this shift from the focus of inner identity to more tactical adaptability to me gives the battle a more role-driven strategic flavor compared to Persona. And another thing I really liked is any character can take on any job and might more or less be skilled at that job, but this flexibility did introduce a lot of neat ways to approach the game, which was something that I liked a lot. Another development that I thought was interesting was that battles now use row formations, where you're placing characters in the front and that emphasizes offense, but exposes them to more damage, while going to the back row favors defense and support roles. This added to the game a little bit of positional strategy that's not present in Persona, and forces players to really think about party layout a little more. For me, with ambushes potentially wiping out your party at the beginning of a fight, it meant moving my players all to the back and positioning them forward only when they needed to do some damage. Seemed to be really the only strategic decision one would make, especially when you're so often going into these ambush encounters either back and forth with enemies from the overworld. There also too, which I thought was pretty interesting, I guess, is this retry option built into battles, which allows players to reset battles without losing progress, so you can try again, making experimentation a little less punishing, which again is just something I haven't seen in an RPG before, I don't think, and was just neat when I came across it for the first time here in Metaphor. And finally, this just kind of goes for an overall gameplay note, but one thing that I really loved about playing this title on PlayStation 5 in particular is that the command inputs are really snappy. You can skip animations for faster battles. Anytime you click a button, there's no like long dragged out animation or time that you're waiting to execute on it. It's just immediately ready to go, the game at all points. So I really like that. And the whole gameplay is super smooth, which was very enjoyable for the chilling on the couch and just trying to grind out some dungeons experience. Overall, yes, there were a lot of interesting ways in which Atlus continued to push the envelope and try new things in this title. And I did quite like a number of them, but there are many downsides to the mechanics I did want to point out as well. So the first of those is that I felt like that positioning system, which I was mentioning, does feel a little undercooked. You know, enemies, they rarely exploit rows, so the mechanic doesn't ever reach its full potential. I did have a bit of an expectation that more enemies would have attacks designed to specifically target the front or back row, creating more strategic decisions on the fly in the battles. But instead, similar to other Atlas JRPGs, the enemies just really eventually start to do area of effect damage and hit your whole party no matter where they're standing. And so I felt like that was a bit of a miss, because there was a way to add another layer of strategic depth by equipping the enemies appropriately with the type of skills and attacks they might employ against that, but unfortunately it just doesn't happen. And another thing I don't think is mentioned as often, but is pretty important, is that the RNG in Metaphor ReFantazio's battles can feel very unpredictable. And I mentioned in my Earthbound review that RNG can be very positive on the overall gaming experience, because it continues to push a little bit of randomness and craziness into your battles and introduce on-the-fly strategic decision-making that you couldn't necessarily plan for. But here in Metaphor ReFantazio, too often do normal encounters suddenly turn punishing if enemies land a critical hit or exploit a weakness. What often ends up starting as a manageable fight can spiral into disaster in just a few moves, which left me more than once feeling blindsided despite solid preparation, or needing to face a 15-minute sponge battle that drains me of my motivation to continue playing the game. And that unfortunately happened a lot here. One of the biggest perpetrators of this is sometimes you'll encounter these enemies that use one of two moves, Soul Scream or Soul Cry. And when they trigger these, they automatically gain up to 4 extra turns in a fight. So you could go in and attack an enemy and say they get a random ambush hit on you. And then they're going to use Soul Scream, and they're going to blast area of effect damage 5 times in a row across your team. And what went from a normal enemy, if you ambush them and hit them, and then you had the opportunity to go at them, you could have easily knocked down, you know, a good quarter or half of their health. Now they're just completely obliterated your party. And your only solution at this point right now is to retry the battle and just hope that doesn't happen again, so that you can maybe pick the pieces up and try to fight. And then that's just the beginning of what's going to be a 10-minute battle where this enemy has 10,000 HP, and each attack you're doing like 70 damage, unless you have a very exploitable weakness that you've targeted on that enemy, which is a little more inflexible than I would have hoped. There are so many types of damage you can elicit to an enemy, whether that's piercing, smashing, slashing, fire, wind, ice, light, dark. Probably a couple others in there, but most of the enemies in this game have one weakness that is on those element attacks: fire, ice, electric, and wind. And I just would have liked to have seen a little more variety, because it would open up more archetypes for your playstyles, because there were plenty of archetypes in here where I could see myself picking and choosing a couple skills from them, but I would never decide that to be the specific archetype I wanted for a certain character, because oftentimes they were useless in battle. If you don't have a weakness that you can drive against your opponent, you're not doing any damage to them, and you're gonna waste so much time in these battles, and it was really draining on me. So yeah, I'll say overall that volatility is pretty fun. It does add a little tension, but here in Metaphor ReFantazio, it's much too frequent and often crosses into frustration when success hinges more on the luck than the strategy in terms of how the cards are going to play in a fight, and whether or not you can land an advantage at the start of a battle, or whether you happen to have the right mix for fighting this opponent that has a weakness that you can exploit and get that little extra turn for the fight. The swing in this game really feels and makes victories feel less earned and defeats more arbitrary, and kind of undermines the satisfaction of the careful planning that you would employ when you go into a dungeon. When I compare this to my experiences with the Persona series and Shin Megami Tensei, I think Atlas really wanted to inject a little extra drama into every fight, but at times it feels like the game is manufacturing difficulty rather than rewarding mastery of its systems. I'm already expecting this game to be 80 to 100 hours long. No need to punish me in just these standard fare battles when I'm just fighting the enemies to move on in the dungeon. Don't do that. And also, to layer on top of that, I think because of that effect, difficulty is solid, but pretty punishing early on in a lot of ways, because you'll have very limited magic and magic recovery options. And so when you're in the first dungeon, grinding makes that dungeon accessible, honestly. Because without kind of grinding and running back through the levels as a mage, which a mage, if they defeat enemies on the overworld, can collect one magic per enemy. You really can't make it through this dungeon without spending 3, 4, 5 days on it because of the length of it. And so that the first few hours of my first dungeon in Metaphor ReFantazio was spent with me running to the rest break room, and then running out and hitting a bunch of enemies, and then running back to the break room, and then running out and then hitting a bunch of enemies, and then running back to the break room so that I could get magic, so I could push on, an extra level or two just to do it all again. So of course that I could complete the dungeon in one day, going back to my experience earlier. It didn't make for a fun time and a good impression for what was going to be the next 60 hours of this game. And even past that, the game has some crazy difficulty spikes. When you get a little bit into like midpoint of the game, you'll go into this 6+ hour dungeon crawl called Dragon Temple Island, where under such the calendar-based system, grinding is really an insane chore that detracts from the title's core experience. What makes it all challenging is I think Atlus really designed Metaphor ReFantazio's new systems with the full gameplay scope in mind. But at certain points, of course, players only have access to very basic or limited tools. Like, of course, retry options exist, but for example, they don't allow you to change your archetypes and adjust mid-battle. And so that would have been a huge quality of life improvement because, okay, yeah, I can retry the battle, but I can't really do anything else. If I don't have the right mix, I don't have the right setup, the right strategy, my best hope is just to die and then just reload and probably lose like an hour of dungeon progress. Again, it's just, there's so many barriers to enjoying this game that I found the gameplay experience to be overall frustrating from the dungeon crawl sense, and that's a big portion of the game, and so that's really bad. So, I mean, there are some attempts to break up gameplay with stealth or like this random shift riding section that lasts like maybe 30 seconds, and it's the only time it happens in the game. But a lot of these like variabilities in the gameplay style when you're in these dungeons feels pretty stiff and underdeveloped. And it's just largely because they lack polish and the depth of the core combat loop that of course Atlus spent the most time and invested in reimagining. To dive a little deeper into those examples, the stealth encounters often boil down to simplistic, avoid the cone of vision mechanics, where enemies are on these very strict, scripted pathing. And there's not a lot of meaningful variation in that style of gameplay, making them feel more like interruptions than genuine challenges. And then to go back to that ship mechanic too, of course, it exists, but it's mostly visually novel. Mechanically, it's pretty shallow. You just move left and right, and it really doesn't offer little more than the scripted movement and basic interactions that I just described. So instead of really enriching the pacing, again, these diversions come across as filler and kind of highlight how much stronger the game is when it leans into its main systems, which I think it just should have gone out and done and reduced the overall gameplay time of this title. Ultimately, some of these developed gameplay concepts and mechanics are thoughtful and interesting, but the combat required some balancing in my opinion, and that's the core of the game. And I feel like this would have just overall improved the gameplay experience and the pacing. And what I ultimately had to do was just go ahead and adjust the difficulty down because I found myself having a pretty solid experience after that fact. What ends up happening with the difficulty adjusted is it means you simply level faster. So battles end on the overworld more frequently, fights in general are less punishing, and the game is already baked in again to be an 80+ hour experience at that pace. So suffering longer battles with more grinding only pushes this game's legendary runtime into astronomical. If you really want to kind of 100% or get as close as you can to that in one run, you're going to spend an exorbitant amount of time with Metaphor ReFantazio, and it was just too much for what was on the plate. And hey, I'll say I'm totally fine with grinding, dependent upon the investment the developers have put into creating a game that the players want to invest in. And a great example of that is The Witcher 3. I think including its DLC all packaged together, my playthrough of that title exceeded 240 hours, and none of those felt like wasted hours. I actually did it a second time so that my wife could experience the game too. And it's because so much of that experience stays fresh and is not particularly redundant, and it's telling a great and interesting story throughout with unique gameplay aspects. And those are all areas in which Metaphor kind of suffers. And outside of its combat, Metaphor ReFantazio builds its identity around exploration, progression, and social systems that expand the player's role in the world. You're going to spend a lot of that time in cities and settlements, meeting supporters who join your cause and provide unique benefits, whether through new abilities, resources, or narrative insights. There are also trait building activities, things like training, studying, engaging in side tasks, helping to shape your character's growth overall and add layers of customization beyond battle stats. And Atlas here also experiments with some new systems that we haven't seen in other games. A great example of that is debates, which appear as a mechanic but are never properly explained, which left me unsure of how they function or what impact they may have. A great example is that I wasn't even aware these debates were things going on in the title until I reached late July in the game, which is about, I think like 80% of them are already done by that point, which was kind of unfortunate. And that's because if I did want to experience them, since they'd already passed, of course, that would mean I'd have to replay an 80+ hour game to check them out. But even then, I think all of the mechanics kind of going on across the story and kind of just exploring its world together really create a loop that feels expansive and immersive, though there is some lack of clarity in certain features, and that can make some of the non-combat side of the game feel a little uneven. I have to expect, again, that Atlas thought players like me would pace themselves out a bit from the dungeons, because by 70 to 80% completion of the game, I had already maxed out supporter roles, maxed out my traits. Basically, I just slept in my bed every day until the final deadline was approaching, compared to other titles I'd played, which I just thought was kind of funny. So yeah, do definitely pace yourself when experiencing just the standard day-to-day in this game. The calendar system is not as strict as in other Atlas titles, and honestly, I don't think the game necessarily benefits at all from having the calendar system. So just enjoy yourself and pace yourself. I think you get a better experience out of the title overall than I was having because of my approach. One of the things in kind of the navigation and world design sense that I did want to explore a bit though was the dungeon design, which I thought was a pretty big weak link in this title. And I was actually really surprised to be thinking that, because I've found Atlas to have very interesting and unique, visually unique, functionally unique dungeon design compared to a lot of JRPGs I played. But in early areas in Metaphor ReFantazio, you'll be in a cavern or a cathedral, and these feel pretty uninspired and generic, unfortunately. And I did mention in later stages you'll go to these places like Dragon Temple Island, which do change up the visual identity a lot of what's going on in these dungeons. But of course, while they do introduce some more atmosphere, they're excessively long, like 9 levels deep, multi 5-6 hour dungeon runs, which turn the novelty into a genuine slog as you approach the end of it. But one thing that I did think was really cool is there's this overworld transportation device called the Gauntlet Runner. I don't know how else to describe it. That's probably the best way. But it's a big highlight of the game. It adds a lot of scale and motion to the world, which I thought was really cool. It makes traveling feel grand and cinematic, and that's just something really hard to accomplish in a title, especially a JRPG title where we already know a lot of the beats are going to be, well, you're stuck on this continent, you have to walk around. Oh, we got to go find a boat. Oh, now we can sail around. And now you're like late game. Oh, now we can fly. We can go fly to places. Happens in every JRPG. And some of that is true here in Metaphor, but I just love their approach to it. Atlas took a very unique way of doing it and had a lot of fun with it, and I think it just adds a lot to just the experience of traveling the world. I also like that travel does not serve as an inhibitor of you doing other things in your calendar days. So while you're on the Gauntlet Runner, you can still do some activities that will boost your traits or have the flexibility to make some narrative progression by meeting with supporters on certain ranks and kind of just continuing to build those relationships with them, which added a nice bit of dynamic aspects to how those relationships and conversations kind of unfold. Still though, again, like a lot of things, because of my approach, and I just blew out and maxed out everything. After dozens of hours of playing the game, activities on the runner did become a little repetitive and offering only minor stat boosts. Like my mage character has 700 magic. What am I going to get from an extra 1 or 2 magic? It's not really doing a lot for me. So I pretty much completed any necessity progression items that you could do on the Gauntlet Runner as fast as I could. And so well before the midpoint of the title, I was again kind of suffering from a lack of things to do on the Gauntlet Runner when we were traveling around. I just wish there was more of it. They should have gone and done more. I thought it would have been fun. Like, just allow us to do like basically all the relationship management, all the trait building on the Gauntlet Runner. That would have been cool outside of like a couple of books to read, or maybe hop in the bath and gain 2 agility points. It just wasn't a lot. And I wish there was just more to do in this part of the game. An area that I think absolutely shines in every Atlas game, and again is the same case here in Metaphor ReFantazio, is the UI, which is stylish, it's animated, it's full of personality, and that's really Atlas's trademark flair, which I find funny because menus are not the first thing that is usually on a bucket list when you're talking about things that a studio does so fantastically. But here the menus feel alive, they have unique designs that make the navigation visually enjoyable. And I am glad that they're fantastic as they are, because you're going to spend a lot of time looking at these. And that's because equipment management in Metaphor ReFantazio, it's a bit of a doozy. It's often clunky because the systems, they don't stay consistent across contexts. A great example is like switching archetypes can randomly alter or reset a character's gear, which then forces players to go back and re-equip items that they had already chosen, or revisit their character loadouts to see, okay, I can no longer equip this accessory item, but my other character can, and it's gonna give them an extra 20 defense. I mean, little things like that were really crazy to deal with. And on top of that, one thing I thought was really strange is while there are neatly categorizations during battle for quick access to health or MP recovery items or damage dealing magic scrolls, when you go into the standard menu outside of combat, all of a sudden this has all been dumped into a single section for you to scroll through. And yes, it's sorted by type, but it really just is an organizational question mark in my head, because it makes it harder to go through those items and plan strategically and see exactly what kinds of things you have. Like, do I have some mana recovering items, and do I have some health recovery items, or do I have a really great magic scroll that could do this XYZ type of damage to this enemy I know is coming up? And when it's all just dumped into one list, of course that makes it harder to visually strategize your approach. All these quirks to me just really created a friction in what should be a very smooth management loop, which left me feeling like there was way too much onboarding to the menu systems overall. I have to guess that they took a lot of the logic built on Persona, where the characters have very specific types of loadouts, specific types of weapons, accessories, etc. that they can use, and applied that concept to the archetypes without much of a solution in mind for how you deal with that when characters switch different archetype types. And then they have to go back and re-equip their screens. I spent more time in equipment management, inventory screen, and Metaphor ReFantazio than comes to mind in any RPG I think I've ever played. Maybe aside from the new Final Fantasy VII remakes. This is just kind of a general call out too, and I think this happens in other Atlas games that I've played. But one of the things I dislike about UI experiences is when they're breaking my immersion. And this happens in the cutscenes here. They're cluttered. There's so many options when a full cutscene is playing, as in you're not just standing there with dialogue and there's a little drawing of the character chatting, which I really like that. But in a standard cutscene you're watching, there's a skip button, and it's flashing and popping up constantly, and it pulls your attention from the narrative and reminds you that you're in an interface rather than watching this story unfold. And that bothers me a lot. Here I am, I'm just attempting to be absorbed in the drama and atmosphere of Metaphor, but I'm constantly getting distracted by UI prompts that feel more like technical overlay than a natural part of the gaming experience. For me, this was creating a subtle but persistent disconnect on the overall game, making the most emotional moments feel less impactful, less cinematic, and less seamless, unfortunately. But I still did go ahead and absorb that story. And so let's talk a little bit about the story. The game really begins with the protagonist entering this grand tournament, a setup that promises political intrigue and a sweeping narrative about succession and power. Early on, you're going to be introduced to supporters who are allies who can be recruited and managed in different ways. And this system gives the impression of flexibility in how you'll navigate alliances. A lot of the relationships kind of hint at this branching narrative, though the actual impact of your choices is often more cosmetic than transformative. So don't get it twisted. This is a linear game, and any narrative choices that you make have no impact on what is going on. And I was hoping we would get a little more evolution of Atlus's style in this respect, but it does continue the very conventional approach of an Atlus game in this experience through and through by, yeah, I mean, I don't even have to tell you what the story is necessarily, but I bet you can guess where it starts and kind of what the ending is going to be, like what the final battle is going to be, who you're going to be fighting. Just in a general concept, I think a lot of Atlus's games are the exact same. But as the story progresses, we do start to get some new things and some new concepts. One of those that Atlus introduces and gets highlighted a lot early on in the game are igniters. But igniters fail to really do anything meaningfully and affect strategy or deepen the narrative. Instead of expanding the tournament framework at the midpoint in the game, the plot instead really shifts focus toward defeating Luis, who is a big other participant in the tournament. And this kind of sidelines the very premise that initially drove the story for me. This pivot makes the mid-game feel a little less cohesive, as if the central hook of the tournament becomes abandoned in favor of a more conventional villain arc that we've seen in so many titles. And some might say, well, the tournament arc by the midpoint of the game is not that interesting anyway. It's just not really doing anything for us. And a big part of that is because, yes, Atlus is not really developing it across the title. I would have liked to have seen more depth of interaction with other tournament participants, maybe fleshing out their characters and their stories. A great instance of this is later on in the game, you'll be in the top 10 ranked for this tournament winning spot, which is basically, hey, I'm going to become king. And aside from two other participants, Forden and Luis, you might be able to guess who some of the others are based on how the plot is unfolding, but the game doesn't even give you a name of who those folks are, let alone some other ideas about the status of the tournament, who really the participants are, and some of their philosophy. You will get a little bit of this when you're traveling in your gauntlet runner and you have to like fight some of them occasionally, but they're really like these no names that just kind of pop up and you obliterate them in 2 turns and then you just move on with your life. And I feel like there could have been a lot more depth into what the tournament's purpose was, the vision, the various people you're interacting with. Maybe the debates would have given me more of that. But the game didn't tell me about the debates. How am I supposed to do them? At this point, the main drive again becomes Luis, and for most of the game, the tournament is an afterthought. I thought it was a really unique idea at the start, but Atlus really didn't take it anywhere. And instead, Atlus decides to attempt to really create their own Sephiroth, essentially. That's what Luis is. I mean, how else to put it? A dude hell-bent on destruction of the planet. I mean, that's how all these JRPGs go, and it's so tiring. One of the things for me that really breathed life into the JRPG genre at large, one that I had passed up a number of more contemporary titles on, because, you know, if I play an Ys game, there's like 17 Ys games that have come out in the last 10 years, and they're all the same game with the same story and the same gameplay. So, like, how can I get invested in a franchise if that's the case? Atlus has just always been one to break the fold. When I've played Shin Megami Tensei 3 and Persona 3, 4, and 5, I really felt like they were all very unique and they were just really carving their own path in such a world. But to go back to this whole thing with Luis, while he is an interesting character, it's one of the most generic JRPG tropes around, and it makes the idea of beating a JRPG exhausting when I know exactly how the game's gonna end, how it's gonna unfold. Oh, there's this twist, but oh, we already knew the twist. I mean, I just think it's fair to accept that an evolution on a game should include an evolution in how you tell a story, what story you tell, what tropes you pick up in order to see those to the finish. This one just really kind of bored me, and I was really sad at where this game was heading mid-game. Late stage of the game is also soul-crushing, so by the time you reach the latter few dungeons, these dungeon crawls really dominate the experience. The layouts become repetitive, enemies increasingly spongy, crazy difficulty spikes, and the sheer length of these sections just really take down the pacing. And around the 60-hour mark or so, the narrative beats for me lost their punch and began to be buried under the grind of dungeon slog. What should really be a climactic experience as you approach this just feels diluted, unfortunately, with momentum really sacrificed to repetition of just grinding out these levels and levels and levels of dungeons. And the stage is followed by an aggressive amount of story development. So when you get to the Opera House incident, this is going to push the story forward a lot and in very intriguing ways, but it's hard to recommend people pick up a game and tell them to have to invest 50 or 60 hours before they actually get there. And that's the hardest part for me, ultimately. I will say though that while the core story wasn't really pulling me in, the world and the lore building here in Metaphor is one of its strongest achievements, especially given that Atlus had to kind of start fresh without the established framework of either of its major series. The overall setting just feels so lived in and cohesive, with these cities and these kingdoms and different cultures that carry a sense of history and weight, with names and places and concepts that are memorable enough to stick with you, giving the impressions of a world that exists beyond the player's immediate journey, which I really loved significantly, and I think Atlus did such a great job with that. Whether it's political structures or mystical elements, the lore is layered in a way that makes exploration very rewarding, and it succeeds in creating a unique identity that distinguishes Metaphor from Atlus's other franchises, and they just really blew out of the park in this way. I think the world that they've designed here and realized is impressive, so kudos to the person or team that were really spearheading that. Atlus also continues the tradition of tackling weighty subjects in their titles here, with Metaphor ReFantazio really exploring destiny and identity. The undertones overall attempt to really address stereotyping, social division, and the way societies fracture along lines of identity or allegiance. But I think one of the challenging things here is that it rarely moves beyond presentation into more meaningful commentary. Many of the side quests introduce situations that touch on prejudice or social conflict, yet the narrative tends to stop at simply showing those dynamics rather than exploring solutions or offering deeper perspectives about those dynamics that exist in its world. I feel like because of that, the game leaves the issues really kind of surface level, more like background flavor than fully realized themes. And it's a noticeable contrast to Atlus's past work, where games like Persona have been bold enough to interrogate societal problems and challenge players to reflect on them. In Metaphor, the choice to present without critique makes the world feel kind of thematically heavy, but narratively passive, missing an opportunity to really elevate its storytelling beyond the familiar fantasy framework it has going on. And while that was the case, I also found that the lack of humor or levity at any point in the title makes the tone significantly heavy, as I mentioned, but also one note, and sometimes even generic, and the narrative feels a little more rigid and linear compared to Persona's more well-balanced of the mythical stakes and the slice of life, the high school humor, going to school, seeing Teddy free ball diving into the onsen. I mean, with some of that missing, I think it really ends up limiting the player experience. It kind of reinforces the sense of rigidity that the game has and narrows the sense of personal investment in the journey. And so all that was really unfortunate to me. And another big aspect of these games is the relationship building, and supporters in Metaphor ReFantazio and their relationship building quests, especially the ones from playable party members, are introduced pretty unevenly, with the first few of these party members arriving quickly in the game and the last ones joining so late that there's little time to really build meaningful relationships with them. Unlike Persona's confidants, the supporters here get arcs that rarely center on self-discovery or personal growth, and often feel more functional than emotionally resonant. And this makes the system feel a little underdeveloped, though there are some standout characters like Heisme. He has an incredible story, and I think these really show potential because his emotional storyline is one supporter that I think really kind of connects on a personal level with the character. But overall, the supporter system itself adds flavor, but lacks the depth and balance needed to really anchor the narrative in a way that, again, Persona did so well. And further, one of the things that I thought was unfortunate is many of the story moments here are narrated rather than acted out in terms of what you're seeing on the screen. And I think that really weakens immersion and makes key scenes feel more distant than they really should. Dialogue choices exist, but they often feel very superficial, offering little real agency or consequence, similar to Atlus's other titles. And then compounding this further, a large portion of the title is not voice acted at all, which leaves stretches of text-heavy storytelling that feel flat compared to the richly animated cutscenes. This absence of performance makes it harder to emotionally invest in the characters or the situations, and ultimately leaves the player more as a spectator than a participant in a uncovering and developing story. Without these consistent performances to carry the tone and emotion, I found it harder to invest in characters and story moments, especially when compared to the fully voiced Persona game experiences, which this is all anecdotal, of course, but as far as I can remember, there was way more voice acting in those titles than I got here in Metaphor ReFantazio. And when you're sitting there for an hour straight reading text on a screen for what should be the main story beats unfolding, I can just tell that Atlus was really pushed to the limit on budget, on time, but for some reason they felt like this game needed to be an exorbitant amount of time. They could easily have cut 20 hours off of this by trimming the gameplay, trimming some of the narrative plots and so on, but they just didn't. And that unfortunately makes the game just overall feel really flat in its tone and really drags out the pacing. But I did want to say that where Metaphor lacks in quantity, I think it has in the quality department, because the performances are consistently strong, with actors bringing real emotion and nuances to their roles. I felt like overall that key lines are delivered with conviction, making dramatic scenes land and quieter moments feel authentic. And even when the game leans on narration or text-only segments, the voiced portions shine enough to elevate the overall presentation. So rather than feeling uneven, the quality of the acting really helps anchor the story and gives weight to the fantasy, which I like. The sound effects experience here is pretty on par with what I would expect. Its quality is great, the sounds are dynamic, and they immerse the player into the world. But one of the really weird things I want to call out, and I don't think this has ever really stood out to me before, but in a game that is, but the surround sound implementation is severely flawed in this game. So if you're playing it on a 5.1 system, I think it'll maybe stand out to you, and does offer a lot of immersion breaking instead of enhancing it when you're playing the title. So a great example is voices awkwardly shift to rear channels mid-battle as the camera positioning changes. So if the camera is positioned behind your player, which is where it would be before you initiate attack, and then all of a sudden it goes into more like a cinematic cam where you're like mid-battle or you're like up close on the enemy, the voice of the character will transition from the front speakers into the back ones. And that was just something that was really tripping me out. And I've not seen that before, because usually what I've experienced is that sound effects are going to play out of those speakers. Voices are going to come out of your center channel in most 5.1 experiences. And I've not seen that in a title before, but that's how I experienced it in Metaphor ReFantazio, and I just thought that was so weird. But yeah, putting that aside, a great sound effect experience and a really great soundtrack experience. At first, the music in Metaphor ReFantazio felt a little jarring. I was like, what are they doing here? Very experimental compositions that don't immediately click with like rapping Buddhists and these epic choirs. But as the game progresses, those strange kind of unconventional sounds really begin to settle into the world and become part of its identity. The soundtrack is weird, it's different, it's unapologetically bold, and that uniqueness ultimately heightens the overall experience for me. I ended up loving the soundtrack. It's so out there. And being unique is something that I always ask for in a game, and so to see it come to life in a title is fantastic, and I just love that they just really went all out here. It's really more than just background noise. The music alone helps to construct the atmosphere of Metaphor and the worlds that you'll visit. It makes it feel distinct and memorable in a way that only, I think, Atlus's risk-taking sound design could achieve. The one thing though, for everything I love on this soundtrack, is that I still found myself missing the presence of a signature opening song, the kind of iconic theme Persona really uses to set the tone and make each boot up of the game feel like the start of a television show. And I feel like that presentation would have overall benefited from such a thing, as opposed to like when you start the game, there's this quiet like cutscene that really kicks things off. And I just thought that was weird. It was like out of character for Atlus. Where was your intro song? We need that like epic anime opening song, so every time I boot this game up, I can just kick back and just enjoy that. All right, a couple other things. Just want to talk a little bit about the art style. Art style is distinct, richly detailed, beautifully saturated colors that make environments and characters really stand out. I did really like the overall palette of the color choice here. And also recently played Sea of Stars, and I commented a little on the cutscenes in that game, but I just wanted to say that animated cutscenes here are done right, in the way I would expect. And they're at this particular high quality kind of anime production level, and it showcases Atlus's trademark flair for visual storytelling, and I really loved what they did here with the style. I'd say that even though I find fantasy to be overall a rather generic approach, the fantasy aesthetics here are consistently striking when the game is leaning into those bold palettes and stylized designs. It feels vibrant and alive and interesting, and I really like the way this game looked from its menus to its worlds. I'll say too, this carries over to the overall monster design. This is a trademark, I think, of Atlus, but just incredible monsters, incredible bosses, just out of this world, wild designs that I thought were so cool and just haven't seen in a JRPG before. So I really did love just the overall presentation of this game. They really knocked it out of the park. I will say though that despite this high level of polish, the character models and environments often carry the impression of being reskinned Persona assets, which can make the visuals feel familiar rather than groundbreaking. I would have liked more of the latter of those two. And I touched on this a bit, but dungeon designs lean heavily into generic medieval fantasy tropes, you know, stone corridors, dimly lit chambers, repetitive layouts, which I think kind of undercut the uniqueness of the world and its characters. And while technically all this plays really smooth, these areas lack the imaginative spark that could have elevated the exploration further. From a more technical standpoint, the game is polished, but the overall art direction struggles to carve out a truly unique identity. So the reliance on like familiar Atlus visual language and conventional fantasy motifs leaves the presentation feeling a little derivative at times. And this really contrasts to Persona's instantly recognizable, more pop art aesthetics and punchy colors. Metaphor doesn't really establish a single visual signature, which makes the world memorable more for its lore than it is for its look. And I think that aspect would have been very cherished if they took a little more time to develop it, especially in those dungeons. Another thing I thought was crazy is that the visuals lack the kind of advancements that I would have expected from a modern release. And in many ways, the game could have plausibly run on a PS3 if it was optimized right, without too many major compromises. And you know, this absence of a clear visual upgrade makes the presentation feel dated, especially when compared to how Persona titles push their respective consoles with bold stylistic choices and sharper fidelity. And I'm not a big person for harking on you know, graphical fidelity and pushing the boundary in games, but since Persona 5 came out 9-ish years ago, Atlus has not revolutionized the technology that they're using, and it's really beginning to show for me. So I think it's worth noting. So a lot of thoughts on Metaphor ReFantazio. This is just kind of the high level of all the things that came to mind as I played through the game. Metaphor ReFantazio for me is truly a game of contrasts. It shines in moments. It's beautifully animated with great cutscenes, stylish UI, some funny objectives as well, but in a lot of ways the game falters in sustaining excitement across its long runtime. The combat tweaks are refreshing, but the undercooked mechanics that come along with them, the repetitive dungeons, uneven audio experience, which I thought was really weird, a heavy, humorless tone, kind of do weigh it down overall. I love really challenging myself and playing games on the harder of difficulties available, but by the 60-ish hour mark in this game, the grind and the pacing and the length of those battles really became overwhelming and forced me to lower the difficulty just to speed the title up, because I was at risk, I thought, of not completing the game, and I really wanted to see it to the end. For Atlus fans, I'd say there's plenty of familiar DNA in this title, but whether that's enough depends on your tolerance for repetition and your appetite for a darker, more rigid fantasy world. I don't think that's gonna appeal to everyone, and Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that feels both ambitious and frustrating. A reskinned Persona with flashes of brilliance is how I might describe it, but not quite the groundbreaking experience I think it could have been, and the way in which a lot of people communicated when they first got their hands on this game and reviewed it. I don't think that they completed it to the end. There's absolutely no way, because I think the opinions would have been a lot more mixed or constructive for Atlus as opposed to the fawning praise that otherwise it was given. All in all, that's how I felt about the game. There are, again, so many things that I have yet to say about it, but I'd love to leave some space to hear your thoughts. Just curious what stood out to you about Metaphor, and if you liked the game or if it drained on you a bit, kind of the way that it did for me. Please share. I'd love to hear below in the comments. And if you like the video, of course, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support is really meaningful to me as a small creator here on YouTube. And I always love to have new friends along for the journey and just kind of hear some of the games I'm talking about, maybe inspire you to try something new as well. Well, until next time, guys, look forward to seeing you again. Stay well, stay healthy. I'll see you in the next one. All right, peace.